My name is Sophia. And I am 26 years old. I was lying in a Boston hospital emergency room. The pain from my shattered pelvis and broken collarbone was blinding. A doctor looked at me. His face serious. Your reaction to standard anesthesia is complicated, he said. We need to use an alternative protocol. It has higher risks. We need family consent. I called my parents. Brian and Michelle. 15 minutes passed. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my father. Brian? I read the words. In an important investor meeting. Can't this wait? We're busy. I didn't cry. I didn't text back begging. I just stared at the words. We're busy. And a strange, terrifying clarity washed over me. The anger wasn't hot, it was clinical. This wasn't a family crisis. It was a balance sheet. And I'd just been written off. The nurse. A kind woman named Heather. I looked at my face with pity. Honey, do you want to try calling them again? I shook my head. The pain in my pelvis was a sharp, white fire. But my mind was suddenly sharp. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I just opened my phone's contact list. I scrolled past Dad. I scrolled past Mom. I stopped on a name I hadn't dialed in almost a year. Aunt Judith. My mother's estranged older sister. The difficult one. The retired history professor who lived in a quiet, book-filled house out in Concord. The one my parents warned me about. The one they called negative and stuck in the past. I pressed the call button. She picked up on the second ring. Sophia. Her voice was raspy. Surprised. Aunt Judith. I whispered. The words catching on the pain. I'm at Boston Hospital. I've been in an accident. I need you. There was no hesitation. New questions. No, can't this wait? Just affirm. Immediate. I'm on my way. Then the line clicked dead. She lived 40 minutes away, without traffic. She made it in under 30. The emergency room doors burst open. And in she came. At 72. Aunt Judith was a force. She was still wearing a muddy gardening sweater and had bits of leaves in her wild gray hair. She didn't rush to my bedside to fuss over me. She stormed right past me. Directly to the nurse's station. I am Judith Mills, she announced. Her voice booming with an authority that made everyone jump. I am Sophia's aunt. Who has the paperwork I need to sign? Give it to me. Now. She read the high-risk consent forms. Her eyes scanning the page with academic precision. She signed her name with a firm, steady hand. As they started to wheel my gurney toward the operating room, she finally came to my side. She grabbed my hand. Her hand was rough from the garden. But it was the warmest thing I'd ever felt. I will be right here when you wake up, she promised. And when I woke up, hours later, through the fog of anesthesia and the dull throb of a healing body, the first thing I saw was her. She was asleep in the hard plastic visitor's chair. Her head tilted back. Her silver hair a mess. She had kept her promise. She was there. Recovering at Aunt Judith's house in Concord was like entering a different world. My parents' world was the seaport in Boston, a sterile, glass apartment that overlooked the harbor, filled with cold metal and expensive art they never looked at. Their lives were a series of capital calls and frantic meetings, a constant hum of ambition. My world was a small, cozy apartment in Somerville, filled with second-hand books and mismatched mugs. I was their nonprofit coordinator daughter, the idealist, the one who, in their eyes, was a disappointment because I chose meaning over money. I took the train. I didn't have a car. In fact, that's how I ended up in the hospital. I was a pedestrian, hit by a rideshare driver who was too busy checking his phone to see the walk signal. My parents' life was a performance. My life was about connection. And in that house, I realized there wasn't just one Boston. There were two. As I lay on the guest bed, surrounded by towering shelves of history books, I tried to understand them. Why busy was the only word they had for a daughter in the ER. And I realized it wasn't just greed. It was a sickness. I call it the more sickness. It's the pathology of hustle culture. My parents weren't pursuing happiness. They were running from the fear of failure. That glass apartment, the expensive watches, the ruthless way they talked about emergency meetings, it was all just armor. It was a desperate attempt to fill a bottomless void inside themselves. A terror that, if they stopped moving, even for a second, they would be exposed as not being enough. They weren't building a future for me. They were just building. The first week was a blur of pain medication and sleep. Aunt Judith was a constant. Key at presence. She brought me soup. She read history aloud. Not children's stories. One evening, as the sun set over her garden, I was strong enough to ask, Aunt Judith, why are you so different from my mother? She put down her book and looked at me. Her eyes sharp and clear. Because, she said, her voice quiet, I saw your father, Brian, for what he was. 30 years ago. I waited. This was the family history nobody ever talked about. Your mother, Michelle. She used to be like me, Judith said. She was bright. She was kind. And then she met him. And she got infected with his more sickness. This obsession with image. With assets. With the stock market. I tried to warn her. I told her he was hollow. What happened? I asked. I was told I was negative. I was told I was jealous. I was cut from the family narrative. It was easier to remove the person telling the truth than to face the truth itself. She looked out the window. So, I waited. I watched from a distance, hoping one day you'd be old enough to see the truth for yourself. Sophia, I've just been waiting for you. I only prayed it wouldn't take a tragedy like this for you to finally see. 4 days after my surgery, 4 days of silence. My parents finally appeared. They didn't come to the hospital. They came to Aunt Judith's house in Concord. I heard them before I saw them. The crunch of expensive tires on the gravel driveway. The precise, sharp click of my mother's heels. They walked in. And the warm, book-scented air of the house seemed to curdle around them. My father, Brian, in a crisp dress shirt, didn't even look at me on the couch. He looked around the living room. A small, disgusted curl on his lip. This place is rustic, he said, as if it were an insult. My mother, Michelle, glided over and placed a gift basket on the coffee table. It was from a convenience store, filled with waxy chocolates and stale crackers. We hope you're recovering well, darling, she said. But her eyes were already flicking to the smartwatch on her wrist. The performance was complete. They didn't ask if I was in pain. They didn't ask about the surgery. They didn't ask what it felt like to be told my life was in danger. My father sat down on the edge of an armchair. The way you sit, when you have no intention of staying. Now, he began, lacing his fingers. This wasn't a father. This was a fund manager about to deliver a quarterly report about this accident, he said. We've spoken to the insurance companies, both yours and the rideshare company. There's going to be a significant settlement, a very significant one. I just stared. Aunt Judith stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, watching, a silent witness. Obviously. Brian continued. You're not in any state to manage this. These things are complex. Your mother and I have agreed. We will manage the asset on your behalf. The asset. He didn't say your money. He didn't say your compensation. He said the asset. In that moment, I wasn't a daughter. I wasn't a survivor. I was a sudden, unexpected windfall. I was a line item on their balance sheet that had just turned green. Manage it. I finally managed to whisper. My throat felt like sandpaper. Yes, my father said, already sounding impatient. Ensure it's invested properly. We'll roll it into the fund. We can't have you wasting it on whatever. He gestured vaguely at my life. At my nonprofit job. My Somerville apartment. My entire existence. My mother chimed in. Her voice a bright, false echo of his. It's for the best. Sophia, we're building this for your future. You just focus on getting better. They stayed for exactly 20 minutes. The timer on my mother's watch must have gone off. We have an emergency call, Brian announced, standing up and smoothing his shirt. Investors. They left. The sterile scent of their expensive cologne lingered in the room. A toxic cloud. The silence they left behind was louder than their words. I looked at Aunt Judith, who was still standing in the doorway. Her face was grim. She didn't say I told you so. She just looked at me with a profound sadness. Now, she said softly. Do you see? I saw it all. This wasn't just neglect. This was accounting. That visit. That 20-minute insult. It changed something. The pain in my pelvis was still there. But a new feeling was overriding its suspicion. A cold, clear, analytical suspicion. Manage the asset. The words echoed in my head. As soon as my parents' car cleared the driveway, I asked Aunt Judith to bring me my laptop. My hands were shaking. Not from weakness, but from adrenaline. I didn't start with my bank account. I started with the insurance. I was on hold for 10 minutes. The terrible music drilling into my ear. Finally, a representative picked up. Yes. Ms. Sophia, the woman said. Her voice professionally cheerful. We see your claim. And yes, your father, Mr. Brian, has been very active on this file. He's listed here as your financial representative. Ice. Pure. Cold ice. Right in my veins. I'm sorry. What? Your financial representative. She repeated. It's here, on your original policy. Signed 2 years ago. It gives him authority to make decisions regarding settlements. 2 years ago, when I'd started my first job, my father had helped me set up my benefits package. He'd sat at my small kitchen table, pointing where to sign, complaining about the complex paperwork. I'll handle this part for you, Sophia, he'd said. It's just standard procedure. I'd been so grateful. I'd been a fool. This wasn't a family drama anymore. This was an audit. I hung up. Aunt Judith, I said, my voice quiet. Can you help me pull my credit report? We sat there, side by side, watching the screen. At first, everything looked normal. My student loans, my one credit card, all paid on time. And then I saw it. A loan I didn't recognize. It wasn't a small loan. It was a business loan. For $500,000. My heart stopped. Not with fear. With a terrifying, cold understanding. The loan was taken out exactly 2 years ago. The same month my father had helped me with my paperwork. The recipient wasn't me. The recipient was Brian Mills Investment Fund. My father's company. How I whispered. How could I be the guarantor for $500,000? My credit. I'm a non-profit coordinator. And then I saw the attached document, the scanned application, and there, at the bottom, was the signature. It was my name. Sophia. But it wasn't my handwriting. It was a forgery. Suddenly, everything crystallized. The emergency meetings. The constant panic in my mother's eyes. The desperate, frantic energy. The text message. We're busy. They weren't busy with investors. They were busy going broke. That $500,000 loan, my loan, the one I never signed for, was about to default. They were desperate. They were on the edge of a cliff. And my accident. My shattered pelvis. It wasn't a tragedy to them. It was a lifeline. They weren't trying to manage my asset. They weren't trying to invest my settlement. They needed that money to cover their fraud. To hide their crime. They were planning to use my blood money to save themselves. This wasn't revenge. This was an audit. This wasn't a family dispute. This was a crime scene. I didn't call my parents. I didn't scream. I called Aunt Judith's lawyer. A man named Peter, she had known for 30 years. I didn't have to explain. I just forwarded him the documents. The forged signature. The $500,000 loan. The insurance policy naming my father as a financial proxy. He called me back within an hour. Ms. Sophia, he said. His voice grave and steady. Do you understand what you are holding? I think so, I said. My voice just as cold. This is not a family matter, he said, confirming my exact thoughts. This is bank fraud. This is forgery. This is a lot. What do you want to do? What did I want? I wanted the life I was supposed to have. I wanted parents who would show up at the hospital. But that wasn't on the table. I want to protect myself, I said. My voice hard. I want to be free of them. I want my name off that loan. And I want to make sure they can never, ever, touch my finances again. Very well, he said. This is a surgical operation. Sophia, we will not be emotional. We will be precise. We spent the next 3 days preparing, 3 days of my body healing, and my mind sharpening. Peter drafted the documents. A full revocation of any and all powers of attorney, financial or medical. A formal cease and desist notice, barring them from contacting my insurance, my bank, or my employer. And the final document, the one that sat on the coffee table like a bomb, it was a formal legal notice. addressed to them and their fraudulent investment fund. It detailed the $500,000 loan, attached the expert analysis, confirming the forged signature, and gave them 30 days to remove my name as guarantor before we proceeded with criminal charges. The night before the meeting, I couldn't sleep. My pelvis ached. A dull throb that had become my new normal. I sat in the dark living room, staring at the blue folder containing my emancipation. I felt a sudden, sharp pang in my chest. It wasn't pain. It was guilt. I feel guilty. I whispered into the darkness. I hadn't realized Aunt Judith was standing in the doorway, watching me. She walked over and sat beside me, her hand resting on my good shoulder. "Of course you do," she said softly. I looked at her, confused. Even after all this, after the text, the loan, they left me for dead, and then tried to steal from me. Why do I feel guilty? Because that guilt is proof that you are a good person? She said, her voice firm. You are the caretaker. The good child. You've spent your entire life managing their emotions, making yourself small so they could feel big. She was right. The audience for the parents who never showed up. That guilt, Sophia, she continued, is the chain they installed in you since you were a child. It's what they've always relied on. They counted on your goodness, your loyalty, your guilt, to enable them to keep harming you. Tomorrow, you are not being cruel. You are not becoming them. You are just, finally, breaking the chain. I looked at the folder. She was right. This wasn't an act of aggression. This was an act of self-preservation. This wasn't revenge. It was an audit. And the books had to be balanced. I summoned them. The text was simple. I need you to come to Concord to sign some insurance papers to finalize the claim. The mention of money, of a claim, was the bait. I knew they couldn't resist. They arrived at 4 p.m. My father, Brian, walked in first, tossing his leather briefcase onto Aunt Judith's antique table. My mother, Michelle, followed, her face pale, her eyes darting around the room as if she were looking for a way out. They were both annoyed by the inconvenience. All right, Sophia, Brian said, huffing. Let's get this over with. What are we signing? I was seated on the couch, propped up by pillows. My body was still healing, but I had never felt stronger. Aunt Judith stood silently by the fireplace, her arms crossed, a witness to the audit. I slid a thin, blue folder across the coffee table. This, I said, my voice steady, is a legal notification. It revokes any and all authority you have over my accounts, my medical decisions, and my insurance policies, effective immediately. Brian stared at it. Then he laughed. A short, barking laugh. Sophia, you're being emotional, he said, waving a dismissive hand. You've had a serious accident. You're not thinking clearly. You can't just... I am thinking more clearly than I have in my entire life, I said. The coldness in my own voice surprised me. I slid a second, much thicker, folder across the table. And this, I said, is a copy of the $500,000 business loan you took out in my name. And this, I added, tapping the last page, is the expert analysis confirming my signature was forged. The air left the room. It was a physical sound, a vacuum. My father froze. The condescending smile evaporated. His face went from confusion to a deep, blotchy red. My mother made a small, strangled sound, like a dying animal. She staggered back a step and looked at my father. Her voice, a terrified whisper. Brian, what is she? You told me you handled that. You told me it was fine. Handled it, I said, leaning forward, ignoring the sharp pain in my pelvis. Is that what you call it? Brian's face contorted. The mask of the successful fund manager was gone. Underneath was just a desperate, cornered man. How dare you? He hissed. After everything everything you've... What? I cut him off? For the first time in 26 years. I interrupted my father. Everything you've done for me. Or everything you've done to me. My mother finally broke. She rushed forward. Not to me, but toward the table, her hands trembling. Sophia. Please. She sobbed. Please. You don't understand. The market. It's just a temporary. If this gets out, we will lose everything. I looked at her, at the real, ugly tears of a person who had just been caught. You already lost everything. Mom. I turned my gaze to my father, who was staring at the forgery document, his mind visibly racing, looking for an exit. An angle. Ali? You left me in that hospital. I said, my voice low and lethal. You left me to die. And now I know why. It wasn't an investor meeting. You weren't busy. You were terrified. You were disparity. You were drowning in your own fraud. And you needed my settlement. You needed my blood money to cover your crime. My mother was openly wailing now. We're your family. My family. I said, looking at my father, is the person who shows up. I pushed a pen across the table. You will sign the revocation. You will sign the cease and desist. And you will sign the agreement to have my name removed from that fraudulent loan. Or this folder. I tapped the thick one. Goes to the district attorney and the SEC. This is not a negotiation. This is an audit. My father looked at me. His eyes filled with a hatred I had never seen. He knew he was beaten. He knew the numbers had finally been run. With a shaking, violent motion, he snatched the pen and scribbled his name on the signature lines. He didn't read them. He just signed. He threw the pen at my mother. Sign it. Michelle. She signed. Her tears blurring the ink. They stood up, defeated. Two hollowed-out people who had built their lives on an image, only to have it all audited in a single afternoon. My father grabbed his briefcase. He turned at the door for one last word. You will regret this. He sputtered. No. I said. Meeting his gaze, I regret not doing this sooner. He left. My mother followed. A silent, weeping ghost. Aunt Judith walked over and closed the front door. The click of the lock sounding like the final, definitive closing of a ledger. The aftermath was not dramatic. It was just accounting. Without my settlement money to cover the $500,000 fraudulent loan, the house of cards my father had built collapsed. It was fast. The other investors, the ones they were always having emergency meetings with, discovered the fraud. The fund imploded. Brian and Michelle were hit with a tidal wave of lawsuits. Their names, once plastered on investment articles, were now only mentioned in legal filings. I used my settlement money exactly as it was intended. For my recovery, I moved out of Aunt Judith's house. Though our bond was now unbreakable, I found a new, ground-floor apartment in Somerville. One, with wide doorways and no stairs. A small patio for myself. It was quiet. It was mine. My boss at the nonprofit had held my job for me, just as he'd promised. When I returned, still on crutches, but strong, I was a different person. I was no longer the good child, just trying to please everyone. I was an auditor. I was precise. I was effective. 6 months later, I was promoted to senior coordinator, with a 20% raise, 6 months after the collapse. My mother, Michelle, called me. She had left Brian. She was living in a small, rented apartment. She asked to meet for coffee. I agreed. We met at a neutral cafe. She looked old. The expensive clothes were gone. Replaced by a simple sweater. The arrogance was gone. Replaced by a deep, weary sadness. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't make excuses. She just sat there, stirring her coffee. Your Aunt Judith. She started. Then her voice broke. She cleared her throat. Your Aunt Judith was right. All those years ago, she was right about him. And I chose the wrong sister. It wasn't an apology, but it was the truth. It was the first true thing she'd said to me in my entire life. We sat in silence for a few more minutes. Two strangers trying to figure out if there was anything left to build on. It was a fragile, brittle beginning, but it was based on an audited truth, not a beautiful lie. That night, I went home to my quiet apartment. I opened my laptop. I pulled up my budget spreadsheet. Everything was paid. My medical bills. My rent. My student loans. The insurance settlement was in my bank account. My credit report showed a zero balance on the fraudulent loan. The audit was complete. For the first time in my life, every single number on the balance sheet added up. Sometimes, to find yourself, you have to conduct a full audit of your life. You have to be brave enough to identify the toxic assets and the fraudulent debts, and you have to have the courage to cut them loose. no matter who they are. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice to protect your own bottom line? Let me know your story in the comments. And please, like and subscribe if you believe in the power of a fresh start. Thank you for listening.